Thank you very much, colleagues. First of all, apologies for walking in late. I was ambushed into conducting an interview with school children, some of whom were from Africa. Since I thought that there are no children here and that was a gap, I decided to donate part of our time to them, and probably was overzealous in that respect, so forgive me. But I think that the question of gaps is precisely what I want to address today. Paragraph 10 of the Zero Draft emphasizes an approach which entails harnessing considerable synergies across the goals and identifying and addressing critical gaps so that addressing one of those gaps will contribute to the progress of the others. My concern and the burden of my comments relate to the fact that despite this recognition and this approach that has been announced by the Zero Draft, it passes up the opportunity to identify how gaps in the functioning and the structure of the international economic environment actively serves to disable development. And one of these gaps in particular relates to the question of the topic today, international investment, trade, and of course that of private finance. And I think that the period that we have between now and Addis has to provide us with a focus, a sobering focus, to radically reorient the approach that the Zero Draft takes in some of these areas. As a matter of fact, the long-term fate and the ongoing experience of those countries that the Zero Draft describes or characterizes as countries in special situations, LDCs, landlocked developing countries, small island developing states, sub-Saharan countries, and so on and so forth, part of their ongoing experience includes the accentuation of recurrent external trade shocks and vicious long-term vulnerability through the workings of international trade. We all were witnesses to what happened, the massive reversals in international trade that took place at the height of the global crisis. On a global scale, there was a reduction in international trade of about 32% between 2008 and 2009 alone. This, in terms of global GDP, this translated into 8% of global GDP. But for these countries with special needs, it translated to between 25 and 35% of their GDPs. What we have to bear in mind is that that scale of rapid collapse has never been seen outside the classical Great Depression in the 1930s. So there are real threats that emanate from the international trade regime. And the anodyne, if you like, and neutral or abstentionist and the rather benign approach that the Zero Draft takes does not suggest that some of these imbalances and inequities that we see, for example, in the WTO is likely to be addressed. So we find that paragraph 73, for example, and other paragraphs call for the continuation of the so-called Doha Development Agenda, which by now is only in name. It calls for the implementation of the Bali Agreement when we know that key portions of the responsibilities, the common but differentiated responsibilities of developed countries in Bali was shirked and was dropped. Their financial commitments on technical support, all of these were reduced to best endeavor language, whilst those that involved the actual restructuring of the economics of trade facilitation, of customs procedures that will ensure that there's a predictable and stable investment environment, a predictable and stable costs for international business, as paragraph 37 envisages here, is available for multinational companies. Obviously, the chief beneficiaries of those trade facilitation agreements will not be small and medium-sized enterprises in landlocked developing countries or in sub-Saharan Africa, and so on and so forth. We also know that, as a matter of fact, the functioning of these transnational companies and the enforcement of trade liberalization agendas through rule setting, through bilateral agreements, and so on and so forth, has also rendered a lot of livelihoods increasingly precarious. There are billions of people today, whether they are smallholder farmers, small petty commodity producers, traders, artisans, and so on and so forth, whose livelihood is imperiled because of increasing, not decreasing, increasing shifts of the burden of the risks and failures of global trade onto their shoulders. So the failures of commodity markets in food, in finance, and so on and so forth was borne by these same people, and clearly there is no attempt actually to redress them. The point about it, the point that the zero draft makes in relation to SMEs, for example, bears the brunt of the problem. Part of the zero draft carries language that we all believe in. It promises outcomes that we all aspire to, the structural transformation of developing countries, these special states, and so on and so forth. But it proceeds along lines which are likely to actually constitute further blockages on this path of structural transformation. We see, for example, that if you juxtapose paragraph 10 and 11, there are clear indications as to what is envisaged as the continuation of the existing global division of labor. Paragraph 10 and 11 juxtapose SMEs with transnational companies and transformative technological dynamics. The SMEs are those in the small countries. The big companies, which will require big infrastructure investment and so on and so forth, like my colleagues have talked about, are those from the north. If you look at the question of social policy and the transformation of social relations through social policy, what you have is the continuation of a residual minimum social provision, which is seen as consumables through which public finance, developing country public finance, will carry the burden. It is not seen as a means of transforming production, the production and provision of those social services by which you actually develop technologies, you build capacities, you employ people, you train women, you diversify the economy. None of that is seen in those terms at all. What we see is that residualism that is continuing. And if you go to paragraph 46, the same approach to SMEs continues to actually prevail. On the other hand, you find the extolling of global value chains as something that has demonstrably assumes a win-win situation for every country in the world, which is clearly untrue. We find that the global value chains are dominated, as the joint African Union and Economic Commission for Africa Elements paper on FFD showed recently from Addis Ababa, from the regional consultations in Addis Ababa. It described some aspects of the workings of these global value chains as oligopolistic, sorry, not my word, of course, as monopsonic, in the sense that they are buyer-driven chains where the real realization of value takes place where final sales are made. Thus, the nature of economic activity is redesignated and reshifted to those areas of the world. And what you have is the integration of these chains by transnational companies concomitant with the fragmentation of local, national, and regional production systems, marketing systems, trade systems, and their parallel financial systems, as we saw in the dismantling of public marketing boards for commodities and for food and so on and so forth. We have seen that with the dismantling of national finance, and we continue to see that in a variety of different ways. So the promotion of global value chains is one of the problematics that I think that it has to be redressed. My final point is to do with two dimensions. In talking about gaps, I think that the most glaring gap, beyond this benign characterization of trade, which is not borne out by experience, beyond this benign promotion of the global value chains, which does not, again, is not borne out by experience, is a glaring silence on the commodity crisis of the crisis of commodity-dependent economies. When you speak in terms of structural transformation, this ought to be fully in view. However, there's no mention of the crisis of the commodity regime in all its different dimensions. There is no mention of any attempt to begin to transform those, but this is actually the elephant in the room. There ought to be, and especially developing country delegates, ought to fashion language that will ensure that there's greater regulation of the volatility of commodity trade activity, that there is actually an integration of commodity structures and their transformation to ensure industrialization and integration of agricultural producers as well, assuring them a stable livelihood, predictable incomes, and so on and so forth. And I think that in subsequent days here, we can provide some language and some considerations of how some of these might proceed. And I think that finally, some new and available additional resources from the commodity sector ought to be graduated schemes of commodity trade taxes as well, after the fashion of the financial transaction taxes as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you,